Good afternoon. I'm Bob Reckman. I'm the City Council representative for Ward 3 and a member of the organizing committee for Design Northampton Week. I have a few brief words of thanks. First, I want to thank all the citizens of Northampton and surrounding towns for your enthusiastic participation in the meetings and feedback sessions that have gone on this week. Your involvement was essential to the success of the week. Second, I want to thank all the city officials, elected and appointed, who contributed their wisdom and resources to our efforts. Third, I want to thank the members of the organizing committee. Would you please all stand up? There were two members of the organizing committee who were particularly critical. Joel Russell, who led the committee with his vision and organizing energy. He unfortunately has been not able to be here for the bulk of the week. Gordon Thorne, who is here, but also contributed to the great space in which the students work, and our thanks to Fourth, I want to thank all the businesses and individuals who contributed money, supplies, meals, or housing for the team. The widespread grassroots support we justify our great hope for the success of Design Northampton Week. Finally, I want to thank the Notre Dame Urban Design Studio team. I'll each stand up when I say their names, led by the Professor Philip Bess. Harry Helpin. Belinda Brown. Scott Ford. Andrew King. And Josh Crystal Owen, my Their training, professionalism and diplomacy have been a great gift by helping us see our city through a new set of lenses. We have been very successful in our fundraising, but we still need about $4,000. If you'd like to make a contribution, Mary Castler and Wendy Foxton over there will be happy to take your contribution. If you want to mail it in, you should send it to APE and mail it to APE 126 Main Street, Northampton. Please write Notre Dame on the memo line of your check. And if one reason we wanted you to sign in was so we could make sure that you know about the December event when the team comes back to Northampton to make their final presentation. When the Steppings event is done, the team will return to South Bend, where they'll continue to work on our project. In October, a delegation from Northampton will go to Notre Dame, and this delegation, along with some professional outside reviewers, will give the team additional feedback on their work since they left. In December, the entire team will return to Northampton and make a final presentation of the recommendations. They'll also give us copies of the recommendations published in a book to include all their final drawings. Thanks again to all the people who I mentioned before. Our mayor, I believe, would like to say a few words, and then we'll turn it over to the team to let you know what they found out. Thank you all again.
Bob says I would like to say a few words. Bob said, as I walked in, would you like to say a few words? So I don't really need to say many words at all because you're really here to listen to the team. I just want to thank them on behalf of the citizens for being here and thank the Northampton Design Forum folks for helping put this together. I'm really interested in seeing what you have to show us, so I'm going to get out of the way. And thanks again for all your work.
Thank you very much. With your permission, I would like to start with something. I'd like to start with something just a little different before we get into the work. Several of the students in the studio worked last fall on a project in Washington, D.C. These are all architectural designers as well as urban designers, and to some extent the scale that they've been working at all week has been at the scale of urban design. But I wanted to show you a little video clip of some of the work that they have done in the past. It's about 3.5 minutes long, and it indicates some of their talents as building designers as well. And so, Josh, if you would run that clip. This just came to me yesterday, and it seemed like it might be appropriate to start with it. I don't know if you need the microphone. because we're not linked.
In fall 2007, graduate students from the University of Notre Dame School of Architecture presented designs for an addition and renovation for Washington, D.C.'s Carnegie Library.
Later.
The Carnegie Building, one of more than 1,500 in the U.S. that Steel Baron Andrew Carnegie built, was home to Washington's Central Library from 1903 to 1972, when the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Library opened. Today, the King Building is crumbling, and some propose returning the library to its historic home. But the idea involves challenges for the building and its surrounding Mount Vernon Square neighborhood.
Doing a project like this is like dropping a pebble in a pond and watching the ripple effects of the propagate outwards. And so for all the students, to greater or lesser extent, they were interested in not only adding on wings to the Carnegie and seeing what happens compositionally with that exercise, but also understanding how that fundamentally transforms the space of Mount Vernon Square and how one can compensate for the things that are lost and what things are gained in that exercise. All of that negotiation with history, negotiation with a venerable old building, negotiation with neighbors, is a theme and a word that the students have heard all semester.
The Historical Society of Washington, D.C., which restored the Carnegie Building, has a 99-year lease. It opened a city museum in the space, but it never attracted enough visitors to be viable. City officials are now looking at the feasibility of returning the library to Mount Vernon Square.
We're getting ready to study this part of the city as a major destination and having this piece of work, this body of work available to the community to stimulate a conversation about this particular building, which is so important to the function of this part of the city as a destination, is really great.
While the King Building is 400,000 square feet, the Carnegie Building is only 78,000. Notre Dame architecture proposes an addition that could overcome daunting historical preservation and environmental obstacles. The Carnegie Library is listed in the National Register of Historic Places, and some of its 60 trees enjoy special protection. The graduate students' goal was to develop plans that satisfy both economic and preservation needs while restoring the Carnegie Building to its original grandeur. Their designs met modern requirements for a top research and learning facility, substantially increasing the size of the building while honoring its historic status. The students also addressed wider urban issues in the neighborhoods adjacent to the building.
Most beloved buildings often have several lives. They serve one function or another. And while this building currently has a terrific use as an institution for music appreciation, I think at one time it was the Carnegie Library. It was a city museum, and it's certainly possible that at some point in the future it could be some other wonderful thing. Perhaps the library can take a look at what kind of needs that modern flagship library might have in Washington, and how this beautiful existing building might be able to be reimagined and added on to sensitively. It's a great thing for the city and a great thing for the students to really sink their teeth into.
Josh, can you start it? Over two to the right. Thank you. Well, thank you. It's been an eventful week, and all of the people that Bob thanked, really just a small portion of the number of people that we need to thank for your enthusiasm, for your participation, and for making it possible for us to concentrate on trying to get to know Northampton and take a kind of close look at Northampton and see what we could see. And so, suffice it to say, we are indebted to you for your hospitality this week, and grateful for that. And we're looking forward to working continuing to work on this project over the course of the semester. We're looking forward, as I think many of you know, we anticipate a delegation from Northampton coming to South Bend in mid-October for a mid-semester review, and then we will be returning, I believe on December 13th is the tentative date, Saturday, to make a final presentation and our final recommendations. The purpose of the meeting today, well, as you know, in these meetings throughout the week, for the last 4 nights and a couple of times during the day, we have been putting work up on the wall. The work that went up on the wall followed a series of conversations, about a day and a half of intense conversation that took place on Monday and Tuesday. That was sort of formal conversations that then was supplemented by additional conversations throughout the course of the week, in particular in response to the work. And so the work has taken shape over the course of the week. What we're looking for this evening, I have about 60 slides that I want to go through and just fairly quickly. I'm going to try to be done by 5 o'clock so that we can leave an hour at least for discussion. And what we are looking for from you, what would be most helpful to us, are your kind of candid responses to some of the proposals that have been made. I should say that these proposals are all they're all very schematic. One of the challenges of this project is that Northampton is a much bigger project than we've tackled before, particularly with 6 students. And so a lot of time has been spent just trying to get to understand some of the physical characteristics of Northampton, let alone the politics, which we have found to be quite challenging, as you do as well. And but it has been a pleasure for us, and we've been very grateful for the goodwill on the part of everybody in engaging us. And we hope that that our work and our proposals will be of value to the city of Northampton and the community of Northampton. So I'm gonna, as you can see, I don't have any notes, but slide. You all know where Northampton is, but I'm just going to reiterate: there's Northampton in its continental context. Next. Northampton in its regional context in the state of Massachusetts. Next. And then a plan of Northampton showing a number of things, actually showing property lines, showing streets, showing buildings, showing land that is in reserve held by the city and land that's floodplain. Showing some of the limits of where we can build, showing the Mill River, showing the edge off the map here of the Connecticut River. Next. And I wanted to start out by looking, and what I should say too about the way that the meeting is, that we want to conduct the meeting this evening, is that I want to go through and present the students' work, and I may call upon them at a certain point because they were involved in things that the details of which even, I'm not even sure of some of all the details of what they were doing. But I'd like to present their work and then would like to have them address your questions. And I'll participate in that as much as necessary, but it's really their week and their work. And so that's the intention, is that I'm going to present this, try to present this fairly quickly, and then turn it over to them to carry on the conversation later this afternoon. So We wanted to start out with a look at the patterns of growth in the history of Northampton. So that this is a diagram that represents, these buildings in blue represents all the buildings that existed in Northampton in 1800. So here's Main Street. In here you can see there's development along Elm Street up in here. At that time in 1800, the population numbered about 2,000 people in 1800. Next slide. By 1850, the population had tripled to 6,000. And it tripled to 6,000. Thank you. It tripled. Everything you see in blue represents the new growth that has taken place in that spanning 50 years. You can see significant growth that's taken place up near Florence. Next slide. By 1900, the population had tripled again to 18,500, and you can see again how the development continued. There was continued development around the core on the opposite side of the tracks here. The development around Smith, up Elm Street, into Bay State, Florence, and you can see the beginnings of the development, or at least the presence of development up in Leeds. So that's by 1900. And again, note how all of this is a kind of compact development. There's a similarity to all this kind of development that's taken place from 1800 over the course of a century. Next slide. That continues as the population grows in the next 50 years from 18,500 to 26,000. Again, the blue represents the extent of the new development that takes place essentially in this area. Next. And then what happens between 1950 and 2000 is that the population growth declines, but you can see that the extent, I said population growth, the population does grow. It grows from 26,000 to 28,000, but the rate of growth declines. But the rapid increase in the land that is settled within Northampton, you can see that it spreads pretty far, pretty extensively into the southwest. You can see the development that starts to take place up here, that the size of the buildings are much larger. The footprints of the buildings are much larger than the historic buildings that had existed in Northampton up until 1950. And of course, what this represents is physical growth that has taken place under the kind of growth that's taken place that we characterize as post-1945 sprawl development that's automobile-centered, and that you can see that what happened is that without a lot of population growth, there's been a significant increase in the amount of land that has been occupied by residents of Northampton in the last, since 1945. Next slide. And so this is what Northampton looks like today. The extent of the growth patterns that we see over the last 200 years as it's grown from a population of 2,000 to a population of 28,000. Next slide. Now, I mentioned on last Sunday evening this idea about traditional urbanism. The traditional urbanism, as we understand it, is characterized by a mix of uses within pedestrian proximity of each other, and that there's a historic limit to the size of traditional neighborhoods, of these traditional mixed-use walkable neighborhoods. And this limit is, the natural limit is about 120 to 160 acres, about a half-mile diameter circle or a half-mile square, a quarter mile from center to edge. So what that means is, in terms of a walking human being, is that it takes a normal human being about 10 minutes to walk from edge to edge, and about 5 minutes to walk from center to edge. And what you can see here is all of these historic European cities at the same scale that are circumscribed, the historic centers of which are circumscribed by this 1/2 mile diameter circle. So you can see Dresden and Florence and Amsterdam and Venice and Berlin. But this is a measure of, in our view, of good traditional, the physical form of good traditional urbanism. Next slide. So these are the areas that in Northampton, these are half-mile diameter circles that we have placed over what, after spending some time here and looking around and talking to people, seem to be both some, obviously significant places in Northampton itself, both the historic center right here along Main Street and around Smith College, but also Bay State and Florence and Leeds, also in, up along King Street here, and you can see that actually this dimension here, this is the Stop and Shop right there, that if you imagine another circle right here, it would come down to about a half a mile and come down to the corner of King Street and Main Street and Pleasant Street. And then also we drew a circle out here because one of the things that we were thinking about as well, in addition to the issues of development and neighborhood character in all of these places, is you can see that in between here and downtown, this is where a lot of the growth, the physical growth took place as a kind of mixed, not a mixed-use environment, but as a single-use environment, sprawl development that took place since 1945. But we thought that this was a kind of an interesting area for reasons that I'll try to talk about a little bit later. But and maybe we can talk about it in greater detail during the question and answer session. But we were thinking about ways in which growth in the outlying areas, how it might make sense to do that. And this was an area that we focused on. Next slide. And so these are larger diagrams showing the building density. The buildings are in black, and the spaces that the buildings define are in white. And so these are a set of diagrams showing the 5 significant areas in Northampton and their relative building density. So that here's the historic center right here. Of course, here's Bay State. Here's Florence. This is the Southwest post-1945 residential development, and you can see the relative. It's relatively less dense, comparatively less dense, than downtown or Florence. It's perhaps about the same density as Bay State, but the network of streets and blocks is very different, and there's some mix of uses that you find in Bay State that are less common out here. And then also looking at King Street, where you can see the kind of commercial development that's taking place at the business park and some of the big box automobile-oriented development that's taking place at King Street that is the commercial counterpart to the residential development that is taking place here. Next slide. And then this is a little slide we just wanted to show, since we showed Florence, Italy and Florence, Massachusetts, we wanted to show the comparative density at the same scale of the historic center of Florence, Italy, and the historic center of Florence in Northampton. And you can see an aerial view showing the comparative density of these two environments. And certainly, and Florence, Northampton has its charms that Florence, Italy lacks, but you can see the comparative density in terms of the amount of activity and building density in these two different environments. Next. I talked a little bit last time about the idea of the transect as a kind of tool that we use to think about both the urban environment and its relationship to the landscape, and also to think about a basis for a different kind of zoning that is based not upon use and segregation of uses, but that is rather based upon a mix of uses, where the differentiation is made between different zones in a city is not based on use, but rather is based upon density and upon building type. And what I'd like to do is to sort of run through again real quickly those T-zones with reference to Northampton in particular, because much of Northampton sort of fits within this idea of the transect as a as an idea that represents the variety of densities and uses that can be found both in traditional cities and in their adjacent landscape. Next slide. So, did you all get, did we get handouts? Where's Aaron? So, I don't know if you picked up handouts, but on last Sunday I handed in the handouts, there was included this brief definition of the transect and the transect diagram. And we've got another handout for that again, so I won't go through and read these again. But as you can see, it represents abstractly this gradation from the natural environment to the rural agricultural landscape, natural landscape to the agricultural landscape, or any landscape that's tended by human beings, to the urban transect, where human beings settle, and then the range of densities that occur across these four transect zones. And of course, I mean, you can sort of think of it like a sausage, right? It's sort of arbitrary to cut it into 4 pieces. You can cut it into as many pieces as would be practical. But just for our purposes, we work with these 4 different transect zones, and then special districts for specific kinds of uses that do not lend themselves to a mixed use environment. Special districts, factories, academic institutions, and we'll see that in a second what that looks like. But here's a depiction in 3 dimensions of the transect from the agricultural landscape going through the most dense kind of urban landscape here. Next slide. And then this is a discussion about the transect as a basis of zoning, and again, I won't go into that too much, but we will be thinking about that over the course of our work, particularly later in the semester. When we go back to South Bend, really the next month, because we're only about a month away before the next visit, and I think that a lot of our attention is going to be devoted to refining the design work. But once we've done that, and once we've had another significant critique of the work that will occur in mid-October, we will begin thinking at that point about zoning issues in earnest, and we'll probably be doing that with reference to the transect. So next slide. Now, I show these 2 slides together to illustrate the point about the transect being about a mix of uses, or I should say traditional urban neighborhoods and traditional cities and traditional towns being about a mix of uses within pedestrian proximity, in which buildings are designed not necessarily, they may have a primary purpose, but they don't necessarily have only a single use. And so what you're seeing here in these 2 images is a house on the corner of Orchard Street that, of course, if you look at it, you understand that it was built as a house, but in fact it is a funeral home, right? And so the idea being that as a type, that this house is a type that is appropriate to a certain kind of zone, but a variety of uses. It's not limited in its use to only a residence, as you can see, in this example. Similarly, a different building type, and again, this is located downtown, a relatively new building with retail at grade and a mix of uses above. I believe primarily residential, although you all would know this better than I. But the point being that that you can have, and this is something that's appropriate to a higher density environment, and this is something that's appropriate to a lower density neighborhood environment. But in those environments, you find a variety of uses that can be accommodated by the building stock. But what's different about these is the type, right? They're a difference in type, not necessarily differentiated in any strict way by their use. Next slide. And so I just wanted to run through a quick review of T-zones in the city of Northampton. And I don't know, did I miss a slide, or I guess it may be coming up at the end. But I wanted to just run through places that we have seen and found that are examples of these zones in the transect that go from the most natural to the most densely urban, or the almost most densely urban. So this would be an example of the T1 natural zone, the uncultivated landscape, the untended woodlands. There's some agricultural land down here, but the forest lands that are generally not part of the agricultural landscape. Next. And then the T2 zone, which is what's being shown in this diagram up here, generally representative of the cultivated landscape. Of course, this is down in the meadows. This is out on the southwest side of Northampton. The T2 rural zone next. And then the T3 zone, also called suburban, but in which it's the lowest density of the transect neighborhood zones. But what differentiates a T3 transect zone from for example, a post-war residential subdivision is not the density, but rather the fact that in a T3 zone, the buildings which may have the same density as the residential subdivision are nevertheless part of a walkable environment and are adjacent to a variety of uses. So that, for example, this is in Bay State and is within a 1 or 2 minute walk of both a local factory and local businesses and the local general store, but is part of this neighborhood of residences as well, where there's not high density, but there is there's pedestrian proximity to a mix of uses. Next. T4 neighborhood general, which is most of what most towns and cities are made of. Actually, this is a street, up not far from Smith College. The houses are a little bit set back, but you can see some of the houses here. It's a walkable environment. The streets are narrow. There's sidewalks. Similarly, this is in the 3rd Ward, just across the tracks. A little bit higher density in terms of the building stock, but nevertheless, likewise, the building stock is essentially residential buildings, but each is characterizable, I think, properly as a T4 neighborhood in the context of the transect. Next slide. And then T5 urban center, and of course the most clearly the densest, the urban center of historic Northampton is downtown and Main Street. There's some other pockets of that elsewhere throughout Northampton, but this is clearly the sort of the signature center of the city of Northampton. Next. And then T6, the most dense kind of urban core, not Northampton, right? No really, most dense urban core kind of area in Northampton. Anything comparable, for example, to what we see in Paris or in London. It's a small city, and so it doesn't really have a T6 urban core. Next. And then finally, this is a map of what we did was we took a look at Northampton and we did a map showing, what a map would look like if Northampton were overlaid with the existing conditions of Northampton were understood and described in terms of the transect. And so what you see here in the dark green would be the T1 natural zone. What you see in the lighter green would be the T2 rural zones. And of course, unfortunately, we don't go all the way out to the river on this because, of course, you've got the meadows out here in the floodplain. The densest part of Northampton. Maybe I should go the other way since we're going T1 and T2. T3, the least dense part of the urban transect is represented in these areas that are sort of light purple along here. T4, the denser the neighborhood general conditions, you can see, is what most of the historic center of Northampton is made up of, and significant portions of Florence as well. Much smaller portion in Leeds, much smaller portion in Bay State. And then T5, the urban center, you can see is pretty much limited to the area around Main Street down here in the historic center. There is no T6. There is a special district, or there's several special districts, and I commented upon those. The special districts are places, they're institutions that have a single use, and for whatever reason aren't necessarily easily integrated into neighborhood fabric. And so Smith College, although Smith College certainly in some ways its building stock integrates well into the neighborhood, but Cooley-Dickinson Hospital, I'm not sure, the VA hospital up here, the industrial park over here, the fairgrounds, that these are all examples of special districts and special uses that are permitted by the transect but are different because, unlike the other zones in the urban transect, which accommodate a mix of uses, the special districts are primarily dedicated to a single use. And then what you'll notice also are the number of areas that don't have any color at all, right? That these are not part of the transect along King Street, in most of the area and development out to the southwest. And the reason for that is because, again, what the transect describes are patterns of development that include a mix of uses within pedestrian proximity. And this is not something that you find either along King Street or out in the areas to the southwest, where it tends to be single-use development that requires an automobile, and so it's in that respect it's not part of the transect. But as you can see, perhaps 80% to 85% of Northampton can be understood. 80 to 85% of Northampton as it exists today can be understood in terms of the transect of a walkable mixed-use environment. Next slide. Now, what this represents, this drawing represents the several areas in which we began to take a look at possible interventions. And again, all of the things that I'm going to show you that the students did here are, they're first drafts, they're schematic, they're ideas tossed out for your consideration, put up on the wall for your consideration. But we started, this is the area around Pleasant Street here. Of course, here's Main Street. Here is Hospital Hill, Village Hill, Florence up here, and then King Street, Upper King Street, although we took a look at King Street in between downtown as well along King Street. And we started out, I'm going to show you the work that we did, sort of in the order in which we did it. We really looked at downtown first, and we looked at Pleasant Street, and we looked at Florence, and then we tackled the more controversial projects on Hospital Hill, Village Hill, and King Street. So next slide. So this is starting with downtown and the area around Main Street. And I think the things that we were looking at in particular was the character of Main Street itself, but also noticing that there's a great deal of surface parking that exists around the perimeter of Main Street, and looking at what possibilities might exist, both to refine a little bit the character of Main Street, but in some ways even more to perhaps take advantage of the area's surface parking behind. One of the things that we noticed, you have a lot of surface parking, and this is something you may have strong opinions about, and will advise us of afterwards. But it did not seem to us that Northampton in some way has a parking problem. Right, that there seems to be plenty of parking downtown. And so one of the things that we were looking at as, I think, part of our design agenda was looking at ways in which areas that are devoted to surface parking can be reclaimed as part of the city fabric, both for its economic return as buildings, residences or businesses, but also perhaps to be shaped as public space. And so that was one of the things that we were looking at as well. Next. Now, again, I really can't go into any detail on this, but there were 3 different proposals that we looked at that dealt with either Main Street itself or the area around the perimeter of Main Street. So this is what in all of these slides, the existing conditions are shown at the bottom of the slide, and the proposed intervention is shown at the top. And usually there's a differentiation made between the existing buildings in black and then proposed buildings in another color. Now that differentiation doesn't always get made. It doesn't seem to have been made. At least I can't see it from here very well. Maybe it's easier for you to see. But this is a perspective view looking west or southwest on Main Street, here City Hall, in which the proposal was for a median that would run along Main Street for a public square at the end of Main Street in front of the main building at Smith College and at this major intersection here, and what would you call it? But this an occupiable area in the center of the block that would be used for market activities, for just a pergola there in the center of the street that you can see in this view. Next slide. Where the other proposal, the first proposal proposed putting some kind of a median in the center of Main Street. This proposal looked actually at narrowing Main Street. One of the things that is very striking about Northampton's Main Street is that it's a very wide street. And in fact, it may be the widest Main Street that I know of that I've seen in the U.S. And not I mean, I'm generally not a fan of wide streets, but it has an interesting character that in one respect it's quite a ways to traverse crossing the street from side to side given the width of it. At the same time, there seems to be a culture of respect from the cars, at least so far as we saw, that people were stopping even before I was ready for them to stop when I was trying to cross the street. We've had discussions about the merits of driving in a condition where there are no lanes that are laid out, and whether that makes whether the chaos is dangerous or whether because there's a perceived danger that drivers drive more cautiously and therefore it's safer. And so we don't have answers to that, but those were all issues that came up. But in this particular proposal, the gist of it was that given the width of Main Street and given the character of the activities that take place along Main Street, this was a proposal to narrow Main Street and widen the sidewalks. Right? So the sidewalks, which are currently about 15 feet wide, our feeling was that there was plenty of room to expand the sidewalks to at least 30 feet, perhaps to 34 feet, which would allow a number of kinds of activities that could take place there, particularly in the summer months during good weather for outdoor cafes or things like that, and even and again, we're told that the median is so wide, or that the road is so wide that in the winter you pile snow in the center of the street. Maybe the snow would get piled on the edge, here on the wider sidewalks under these circumstances. But that's what's being depicted in this particular intervention. There was also a move made down here for the proposal of some buildings being located built on these parking spaces, what is currently surface parking. And one of the things that we became conscious of in the course of our stay was the limitations that the city faces in terms of raising tax revenues. That it's pretty much limited to property taxes on both real estate and on commercial real estate and residential real estate. But one of the things that occurred to us in this proposal, and maybe also in the next one, once you go to the this is a proposal that really focuses, it doesn't focus so much on the center, or maybe it takes for granted some of the other proposals that were made, the other two proposals, but it looks at a way of using the space behind the building, right? So that this is the existing condition, right? Here's where we work, right here. Here's Main Street. Here's the church. Here's the parking garage right here. And this is a big surface parking lot that extends all the way back here to the back of this building. What's being proposed here is that on this site, that it be replaced, that this parking lot be replaced by a building that fronts what then would become a plaza right here, as you can see. And it may be a little hard to read because this shows a pergola here that makes it look a little bit like there's a roof or that it's raised, but it's actually flat. The presence of the pergola actually may be something that we would want to reconsider or think about how it could be configured. But the idea would be that this would be a new building that would front the plaza, and so it would still allow service from the rear to this building and service from the alley to the rear to the buildings that front Main Street. And by fronting the plaza with this building, with the parking garage, in which I'm told that there could be there's room for commercial, ground floor commercial in the parking garage, and then being fronted by this building as well, you can actually create public space in a place where, again, it's our understanding that there's a kind of ad hoc market that has already begun to locate there. And so you could, with not a lot of difficulty, you could take a space that's being used in a public way and sort of formalize it and actually make it more of conscientiously make it more of a design center for the city. The other thing about this, of course, is that this is depicted here as a two-story building, but it actually could be higher. These are all 3 to 5 story buildings right here. If this were a taller building here, it would not only give further definition of the space, but of course, my understanding is that this land is owned by the city. And so, I don't know if the city wants to get into real estate development, but again, it could be a way of raising additional revenues. And certainly in our thinking, as you'll see in some of the proposals that the students made, particularly in the area of King Street and in other places, a primary thought in the back of this is, was about an increase, the potential increase in tax revenue from the new businesses and the new residences that were being proposed. This raises all kinds of other questions as well that again came up in the course of our conversations during the week that we may want to pursue late this afternoon. But anyway, in this proposal in particular, it focuses upon taking an area that now devoted to surface parking and using it for a higher public purpose. And a similar kind of thing we think could take place around some of the other areas at the perimeter of Main Street. Next slide. And actually, this is what's the name of our friend from Keith? Traffic department. Planning, traffic engineer from Scotland, from Edinburgh. And this is, I'm sorry? Keith, yeah. So this is Edinburgh, Scotland, and this is George's Street, and it's in the new town of Edinburgh. Key Street, a fine 4-block long street. You can see a little bit here. There actually is. This was taken early in the morning, about 7 in the morning. But there's room for parallel parking. There's you can see stores, buildings on both sides with retail at grade and residences above. And there's a monument at each intersection here. And what you have in the middle that I think is quite interesting is this different paving. It's a median. It's like a hard surfaced boulevard, right? So, but it also allows perpendicular parking in either direction, so that when there's no one parking there, you have this sense of it, as a boulevard that helps define the character of the street, and actually could be used, I'm sure, for special events when cars were being parked there. But when cars need to park there, they also have the advantage of being able to park in either direction and go out. So in addition to the parallel parking that you get here, this median serves as an additional source of surface parking without being devoted. It's not a surface parking lot, right? It's part of the street, and a very handsome street as well, largely having to do, of course, with the relationship of the street itself to the buildings that front it and the space that's created, and this reciprocity between the buildings and the space. Next slide. Related to issues of downtown and related also to issues of development on Village Hill or Hospital Hill, one of the students, Cohen Brown, took a look at the issue of what might happen to traffic that comes, that would be coming out of the new development that presumably is headed, out to Route 91 for commuting. Because again, when we took a look at Hospital Hill, and part of the proposal for Hospital Hill, as we understanding, is that it be a mixed-use sort of village kind of environment. And so presumably there would be some things that take place there that people could walk to. But in the case of driving, presumably many people who work up there would be driving out to work. And so this is the current, again below, we have the current condition where the presumption is that people would come out, if they were going to I-91, they would come out and drive up along here. And this is what, this is south, or this is west? West? West, yeah, West Street, and they would come up into Main, and then come out to on Pleasant Street to get out to I-91. In this proposal, the proposal would be to divert 66. Sorry, I'm having trouble with the pointer. Divert 66 through this land right here, right? So it looks like there's 3 pieces of property here, and then along, joining up for a portion of the bike trail, but then connecting over at a roundabout here that would then take cars either up to Pleasant, or would divert them down Cons, where they would meet up at Pleasant and head out to I-91. With the idea being that it would relieve congestion on Main Street. That right now, one of the things about Main Street seems to be the only place where there's quite a convergence of traffic. It appears to be the case. There's quite a convergence of traffic there every morning, and so the intent behind this was to see if there was some way of diverting at least some of the traffic away from Main Street. A second alternative, next slide. And again, this is the existing condition. This is the proposed condition. Second alternative was to relocate Route 66 along the edge, and actually coterminous with the area that's the right-of-way for the bike path. And the presumption would be there'd have to be some grading in there that would increase that would make it possible for vehicles to work there, or to drive there, and share the space, presumably differentiated, but share the space with bicycles, and that would lead it up to through an existing parking lot in front of what would be proposed as a new square or a new plaza up here, and then down on Pleasant Street and out. Kalinda can talk about the details of that afterwards. I'm sure that many of you have ideas and thoughts about that. So next slide. And because it's not clear to us what makes sense politically, your feedback is especially important. This is in Florence. Next slide. A couple of different proposed interventions in Florence, mainly concentrating upon Main Street up to, Maple? Yeah, up to Maple. Proposing some infill development, some mixed-use development along there. A better definition of public space, perhaps some kind of a civic building that helps define that, the triangular space at that point, at that juncture in Florence. Next slide. And then another one with similar kind of development, although not quite as prominent, a space in front of the building. Similar kind of, I think, mixed-use development at least along this edge of Main Street, but also the proposal for a certain kind of affordable housing an example of which I'll show you later, that would be located here. We'll get back to housing issues a little bit later, just very briefly. Next slide. And this is a section, a cross-section cut through the street for the proposal for Florence. So that this is the intersection, I presume, at Maple Street. Is that correct? Yeah. So this is at Maple Street. The existing conditions right here, where you've got a single-story building on one side of the street. You've got the gas station, the abandoned gas station now, on the other side of the street. And the proposal that the buildings, be allowed to be developed at a height of about 3 stories, so that there's a spatial enclosure that takes place. And the significance of that is not to propose that kind of development, everywhere throughout Florence, but particularly to focus upon this intersection, right, which is a major center intersection of Florence, and the possibility of creating additional retail opportunities and creating additional kinds of housing opportunities as well, in addition to providing things that then become more walkable to the people who live within a 5 to 10 minute walk in Florence. Next slide. And then the third area that they looked at the first day that they were designing is down on Pleasant Street. Next slide. And I have to say, I'm not, you can see, this is the existing condition here on the left. And on the right is the proposed intervention. You can see the bike trails that run through here. And essentially, this is an infill strategy, both along Pleasant Street, but also to some extent along Cons. Again, with the objective of looking for vacant, underused sites where there might be an opportunity to put additional mix of uses in multi-story buildings. One of the things that came up in the course of our discussions was what was perceived to be a lack of sort of incubator space for small businesses, and so one of the things, and it occurs to me that we didn't provide. I don't have slides of the sort of the mixed use, work-live space, but it's a building type that it's not only old mills and old loft buildings, of which you have many of those in this region, that can be used for live workspace, but it's also a building type that has started to find its way into the market in single units or clusters of units that are part of a regular urban streetscape, and so it's an idea that we were thinking of and looking at also when thinking about development on Pleasant Street. Next. And then this is the second proposed intervention, and again, I think I'm going to let the students talk about the details of that if people want to talk about that. Next slide. Day 2 of our design work, we zeroed in on a couple of the more controversial projects in town. King Street and development on King Street, and also development on Hospital Hill or Village Hill, depending on which side of the controversy on which you reside. So this is King Street. Next slide. And there were a couple of different proposals for King Street, and one of them looked at King Street actually all the way, and again on the left is King Street as it exists right here. So here's King Street, and again everything in black is existing building. Here's the railroad track that divides this part of town from the business park and from the third ward over here. And you can see there tends to be some more higher density development on the southern end of King Street, and then when you get to a certain point, it turns into typically single-use commercial-oriented or automobile-oriented commercial activity, which is how it's zoned. And so there were a couple of different proposals that the students did. One focused on all of King Street from Main Street, from the corner of Main and Pleasant all the way up King Street, and the other actually focused on Upper King Street and its possible relationship to the business park located over here, and also how development that comes off of King Street would relate to this sort of nature preserve over here that I guess we started referring to as the Beaver Reserve. We were told that there's a colony of beavers that occupy that, and so we were intrigued by that, and of course wanted to do everything we could to support them, help them flourish. But the kind of development that's proposed along here is primarily, you can see up at the end, there's some room for some sort of bigger box, bigger footprint kind of development. But as you can see, when you from this point really further south, the development tends to be that's proposed tends to be more mixed-use buildings, 3 to 5 stories. Not taller than the Hotel Northampton, but somewhere between 3 and 5 stories, particularly around the corners, right? Because if you remember our 5-minute walk diagram, the distance from here to here is about a half mile, and so the students proposed that this kind of higher density center right here, and extending a couple of blocks in each direction, or a block maybe in each direction, in both directions. Here's the Stop and Shop if you're trying to get oriented. And then likewise, similar kind of high density development down here, which largely exists, but then in between, proposing a lower density, a more a T4 or T5 kind of development, where the density might be, where they might be mixed use buildings that would be located along here. In the middle, they might be single family houses, but they might also be multifamily dwelling units. They might be apartment buildings, higher density buildings that also serve to create a certain character. I'm losing the other. But that would try to develop along King Street to give it a more spatial quality, so that King Street, instead of becoming a kind of arterial, sort of suburban-like arterial, commercial arterial as it is now, it would function like an avenue, or it would be not function like an avenue, it would be an avenue with respect to the kind of uses that would be found upon it, and also its capacity for traffic. Next slide. Oh, I'm sorry, go back. The other thing is that, particularly up in here, and I think that this is actually one of the very successful kind of proposal up in here, is that there's an orientation of these blocks. The students actually, up in this area, there's enough room behind the tracks that they were able to employ an alley system, so that the blocks they become a kind of T-shaped alley. The blocks have T-shaped alleys, so that the frontage, so that the buildings on the ends of the block can front King Street, but they orient to a street that runs perpendicular, to streets that run perpendicular to King Street. And so the character of these streets can be completely different than the character of King Street, where King Street would be, would be an avenue with, calmed and reasonable traffic owing to the design. And the buildings would shape space and would be sort of higher density. 100 feet back, right, beginning then back into the neighborhood, you'd have, typical T4 residential streets lined with trees, with yards, that kind of thing. And it's a very common kind of urban phenomenon in towns and cities. So I thought that was a particularly interesting example. Next. Now, this is the existing condition at King Street, looking just north of the Stop and Shop right here. So this is the view of King Street. And the next slide is going to show what the proposal is for the kind of development that the students propose next. Right, so this is the plan. This is the same view taken from the same place with this kind of proposal along the street for this kind of development. And so you can see the difference in character. The street has been narrowed, but you can see it's it has multi-story buildings with mixed uses. Next slide. And then the second proposal didn't so much tackle lower King Street here, but it did tackle tackle Upper King Street and its relationship to the industrial park. And here again, if you look at the development along King Street, I mean, we're trying, you know, I think our assumption has been that there's certain kinds of uses, right, that have been, it's been explained to us that these uses are desired for King Street in part for the revenue generation, but also in part to provide services, right, that you know, or I should say, you know, opportunities for certain kinds of shopping that would otherwise, you know, residents in Northampton would go someplace else to buy those things. So big box kinds of operations, and the automobile dealerships were another thing that was mentioned to us. And in our thinking, in the students' thinking of this, the effort was made to really think about how those kinds of businesses might be able to be accommodated on King Street in an environment that is essentially urban rather than suburban. You know, in multi-story buildings rather than single-story buildings, in buildings that are, you know, brought up close to the street. And so those were issues that, you know, you can see are at work here. There's a couple of you know, large footprint stores that are being proposed here. Along here, the more mixed use buildings, but with a significant amount of parking in the back. You can see as the development comes out here that a street cuts through, and there's an orientation then of the buildings to the you know, the preserve to the west. And then the other thing that they proposed was some rethinking of how you know, of how buildings align themselves and are used in the business park, so that actually some of the big footprint buildings could be located on one side of the street, but there would be an opportunity to interject a network of streets and blocks and maybe smaller scale residential development that would allow, again, for perhaps some people to walk to work, for some people to, you know, live closer to where they work. In all of this too, our understanding is, and our assumption is that passenger rail is being restored along this line sometime in the next 2 or 3 years, and limited. I think our understanding is limited from Springfield or New Haven to Vermont. I don't know, Burlington, or if it's Burlington or Brattleboro, but any kind of transit in those directions would be useful. And so that was something else that was informing our thinking. Next slide. Yes, Hospital Hill, Village Hill. Next. This is not the original proposal for Village Hill, but this is the footprint of the old hospital right here. And so this is the existing condition. And then this, there were 2 different proposals that the students came up with for how to handle both the proposed development to the north of Route 66, but also to the south of Route 66. And again, it's our understanding that the intention behind this development was to create a mixed-use village development with some retail on the southern side that would also be integrated in with a mix of uses, but that subsequently Cohen has decided that it wanted to relocate from its plant on King Street to Hospital Hill. And so the plan that we saw, and again, it doesn't show down here, but the plan that we saw showed essentially a kind of big box footprint located at the center of the site with parking to the east of it, and again set back from the street. And so one of the things that we were trying to do, there were 2 things actually that the students who were working on this were trying to do. One was to take all of the existing construction, take the existing plan and the existing construction that has taken place and is taking place up there now, and figure out ways to increase the density, both the density and the mix of uses within that infrastructure framework and the framework of the existing buildings that are under construction. So that was one exercise. And what you increased the number of housing units?
Initial studies by about 100 units.
Yeah, so maybe 100 additional housing units, but also some additional commercial square footage and retail square footage proposed. South of 66, there were 2 different schemes. or two different proposals that were made, because to the north it's the same proposal, right, on both sides? Yeah, okay. So in this particular one, you come along Route 66, and then you turn in, and Cole Morgan is one side of a street that terminates on a plaza right here overlooking the landscape that slopes down toward the river. And so Cole Morgan's footprint, the same footprint that they had was accommodated, but it was done in such a way that it became part of the streetscape, opposite buildings that were used, intended for mixed use, and the parking was located behind those buildings and behind Cole Morgan, so that again, the parking, they have the parking that they need, but it's surface parking, but it's located not out in front, but rather it's located in such a way that reinforces the attempt to make a kind of spatial and a neighborhood environment. Next slide. And then the other proposal was actually to bring some development, some mixed-use development at the corners and some residential development further away from this intersection along Route 66, and to locate Cole Morgan back here again as essentially a big box, big manufacturing box, but to set it back, give it an entrance that sort of allows it to play up its significance, its architectural significance, both terminating this axis, but also as you come in, so that you have this sort of grand entrance into their manufacturing facility. But then behind it, it's basically, it's basically a warehouse building, not a warehouse building, but a manufacturing building. But again, it's pulled off of the street, so that they do have an architectural prominence as befits their, the economic and role that they're playing in the development. But at the same time, it allows for this spatial condition to be reinforced and allows for mix of uses to remain in the context of Hospital Hill. Next. And again, these two slides are just. I show them again. We've looked at them before. They're the slides that have to do with alternating the Route 66 as it goes into downtown and diverting it from Main Street. And I don't need to say anything more about that. Next. Same thing. Next. And then just real quickly, there are a whole lot of issues that we weren't able to begin to think about in much detail at all. But we did, collect some data, some maps and information showing above sort of the whole network of Massachusetts rail lines that existed in the first part of the 20th century, and likewise the extensive trolley line system that existed in Northampton. And this map is cocked a little bit. It's not north up. Downtown is here. Here's Elm Street and Florence out here. So, but there was this extensive trolley network that went out to every part of the city that we found very striking. And again, we've had some conversations about what sort of makes sense in terms of public transportation in a world in which it's going to be more expensive, at the very least more expensive to drive, if possible to drive at all. Next. And then likewise another diagram looking at the bike trails and the public green space. I should say that one of the aspects, or one of the elements of one of the proposals for King Street was to connect, was to make a new roadway connection south, east of King Street and south of the business park that connects over to Damon Road. And it's the location of an existing bicycle path there. And this is let's see, this is not a casually made suggestion, and we wouldn't make it if we thought that it couldn't be done in a way that would have many more benefits than it would have liabilities. But that's again an issue perhaps to discuss. Next. And then finally, almost done. I just wanted to highlight some differences between the kind of culture of building that existed in Northampton prior to 1945. and the culture of building that has replaced it. And it's not, and obviously not only in Northampton, but that has replaced it everywhere. And this is not something that, let's see, it may seem unkind to juxtapose some of the things that I'm going to juxtapose. And we recognize that, you know, that what we're showing that, well, the French preservation movement has a very interesting set of categories and how they determine what buildings should be preserved. They have essentially 4 categories. The first category is buildings of national significance, buildings of local significance, buildings that are acceptable, and buildings that are regrettable. And all of that is to say that, you know, we're not focusing upon any one group of people. Architects are as guilty as anybody for many of the regrettable elements of our built environment. But at least, you know, one of the great things about coming to Northampton is that there's so many good examples of existing durable, beautiful buildings that you know we used to be able to make these buildings, and we hope that it might be possible to make them again. So this is just a contrast between what Pleasant Street looks like on the north side as you approach Main Street, and what it looks like on the south side as you head out of town. Next, the old courthouse and the new courthouse. Next, the old post office and the new post office. Next, the old jail and the new police station. And I say new police station because I understand you're on the verge of thinking about a new police station. But and of course the old jail, I'm sure it was not a great place to live when one couldn't leave, but it obviously lends itself apparently to a good building environment now. Next slide. And then one of the issues that came up several times in the week was the issue of affordable housing. And we had a number of discussions with representatives from various members of the community and groups who are concerned about providing housing, both private developers, housing provided by the private sector, and housing provided by either the public sector or by nonprofit community development organizations. And so I show these images as a couple of examples of a couple of different ways to approach this. The houses on the left, and these two slides belong together. This is a collection of about 20 dwelling units of about 400 to 500 square feet. They're located in Bruges, Belgium. There's several of these kinds of developments within Bruges and indeed throughout Belgium, and it's part of the culture. The buildings are between 300 and 400 years old, and they're called God's houses. And what they were is that they were the product of a pious commercial culture, right? That basically merchants formed as citizens groups. They undertook the responsibility of attempting to provide shelter for the poorest members of the community. And they built these buildings that are just remarkable in their beauty and in their simplicity. And they stand to this day and are used for the same purpose to this day, now operated by the city of Bruges, but originally initiated out of the private commercial sector. To the right, not very far from here, in Holyoke, is a project called Churchill, which is Section 8 housing, public housing subsidized by the federal government, that is laid out it's really quite a good plan. It's a little, this is an aerial view. I'm sorry, this is a plan view. This is an aerial view. The aerial view in some ways doesn't do it justice because sort of what you see the most of are the backs of buildings. But these buildings all have the right relationship. They all have the right relationship of the front of the buildings to the street. And one of the things that's been characteristic, not only of public housing, but also housing in general since 1945, is that often there's this kind of confusion about how buildings should relate to the public realm, how houses, businesses should relate to streets and squares and avenues. And this project really gets it right. And again, you can see that there's a certain quality, even with an economy of means, that this is housing for poor members of Holyoke, and they did a really nice job. And so we just show these as examples, two examples of different approaches from the public sector and the private sector that that together might suggest ways in which the issue of affordable housing, and not just affordable housing that's not market housing, but housing for the poor. How housing for the poor can be at least partially addressed by the community of Northampton next. And then there's the issue of affordable housing as it's provided in the private sector. And part of that, we think, is a function of providing a variety of housing types. Whether it's the coach house, a small unit, an ancillary unit to a larger building that's controlled by the owner, and rented out to a student or a single person or a couple, or whether it's row houses, party wall buildings, or whether it's apartment buildings, or whether it's a refurbished jail. And I have no idea what my sense is that probably all of these properties cost quite a bit more than properties in South Bend, Indiana, simply by virtue of being in Northampton instead of being in South Bend. But all of these represent a different, different kinds of dwelling units that are common to cities and towns, traditional cities and towns next. Other kinds of prototypes, multifamily dwellings, domestic dwellings, four-story buildings on Elm Street, buildings that, these two are on Elm, these are actually over in the 3rd Ward, but wonderful examples of multifamily housing that are not in any way, shape, or form institutional, right? These are buildings that are good pieces of architecture, good buildings that have about them a certain quality and integrity and aesthetic quality that provide, in fact, a variety of housing types that are critical to any community that wants to maintain a kind of diversity of class within the city. Next. That's it. That's it. Well, I mean, there's a lot more that we could have. There's a lot more for us to think about. And we've got a semester to do it. So we'll start now. We welcome your candid comment. And some things that would be most helpful to us would actually be for you to say, this is a good idea, this is a bad idea. And we expect there might be some disagreement about that, and obviously we'll have to negotiate that somehow. But this is an opportunity for you to let us know if you think we're on the right track about some things or on the wrong track about some things. There's also there are a number of issues that we are thinking about that we just haven't had a chance to address. Thank you very much for coming, and we look forward to the conversation. Scott Ford reminds me that for those of you that came late, drawings that we did over the course of the week are all displayed on tables around the room, diagrams and drawings. So we invite you, again, we're here for a while, and but even after we're done talking, feel free to look around in closer detail at the work that we've done. I'm going to turn it over to the students. So please stand up, come to the microphone.
Sure, yes, basic question, which is, it's wonderful to see these things, but certainly what you are looking for is more than just our surface reaction, ideally. Is there a way that we can continue to have access to this presentation, the work, the drawings, the proposals through the semester so that we can see them, we can ponder them, we can think about them, and give you better feedback than just our immediate reaction?
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, certainly. certainly that's something that we'd be, that we'd really like to encourage is sort of a continued dialogue through the semester. As Professor Best mentioned, we're going to be inviting a few people from Northampton to come to South End for the mid-semester review, and that'll be an opportunity to sort of critique in a formal way what we've done to that point. And then, obviously, we'll be back in December. One possibility that we've discussed in the studio is that of trying to create a website. We don't know yet whether we'll be able to have time to do that, but I think that would be a really great way to try to encourage people to give feedback and to be able to show you what we're working on through the semesters. I think we're going to continue to talk about whether it's feasible for us to do that. Short of a website, there is already an email mailing list. If you send an email to, let's see, it's Notre Dame Northampton @gmail.com, you can put you on the mailing list for updates. And that's a list that is maintained by the Northampton Design Forum, I think.
In the back.
In the back.
I was just going to suggest that the $10 you can get from mac.com, I think, a large enough space to post the slides on the presentation you just made.
That's great.
Yeah, I would just comment on this. You guys have had a marvelous academic experience in a real live goldfish bowl of a real community. And I think one of the most effective techniques that you've been able to use, in that we recognize that this is a process, it's not a finite product, you're not telling us what to do, you're giving us a variety of solutions. You're saying it could be done this way, it could be done that way. And I think that is the way to make this exercise much more usable, not just simply to diffuse political sensibilities or something like that, or there are some problems that are just, insurmountable. But you can say, we'll look at it this way, we'll look at it that way. So I would strongly recommend that you continue with that approach when you deal with these kinds of projects over the next several decades, I hope. And in real life when you become grown-up architects.
I was intrigued by the proposal for King Street and the avenue concept. I was wondering if you factored in the fact that King Street and Pleasant Street is really the truck route into the city, and the fact that Route 9 doesn't work very well and the trucks tend to get stuck under the railroad bridge on Main Street. In reality, the bread on the shelves at Stop and Shop comes in on an 18-wheeler. And was that factored into your avenue concept? If not, how would you deal with all the truck traffic and the noise that the truck traffic makes?
Yeah. I guess as far as the design of King Street goes, it is a different set of principles that you have to apply to King Street as opposed to Main Street, just because of the truck traffic and the different types of businesses that go on out there. The street sections that we took a look at include enough space for truck traffic and things like that. There's a bunch of different ways to accommodate the turning radii, which is pretty much the main concern with trucks. The widths obviously fit with this right down the street and everything, but the turning radii are the biggest concern with that. And a number of proposals that we had for particularly Stop and Shop and the big box area up in the north was to not just look at intersections with buildings pushed all the way up to the street, but also buildings that have chamfered corners, basically that are 45-degree angle, possible, I guess, plaza space, a circle, different type of ways of dealing with those types of issues that you raise. And specifically, we didn't take a look at specific truck dimensions and things like that, but the way we designed it could easily accommodate it.
I think the design for King Street has a lot of potential, and it's so nice to see a picture of attractive downtown-style buildings replacing a lot of the sprawling buildings. The only thing that concerns me a little about the way you're proposing to change the parking and traffic situation in the core downtown is that it seems like a lot of the economy now in Northampton depends on people coming in from outside, from the highway. So if you're thinking of downtown being supported by the local community only, you're going to see a totally different type of businesses than what we have now. I mean, right now, there's a lot of tourist traffic and a lot of high-end businesses that support that, and they need places to park. So if you're trying to make downtown less car-friendly, how is the fact that our economy really depends a lot on people driving in from outside factor into that?
Yes, just to repeat the question, I believe that the question was asked that how would we factor in the economy in downtown if we were to, what is perceived to be make downtown less car-friendly? And is that more or less the question?
The large percentage of the economy is based on tourism and people coming in from outside the walkable area supporting the businesses that we have right now.
Well, we appreciate that. And there's several answers to that. First point being that in all of our plans, we build in an element of adaptability. We think that's key, that we've experienced lots of communities around the world that are several thousand or several hundred years old that have adapted to the car and were around before the car and after the car, and they're still wonderful places. And so one thing that in all of our plans is that the ability to grow and to handle that that flexibility. Two, that several in our focus groups and in our meetings with folks in the community, one of the main concerns was that downtown had stopped serving local residents and the services and the shops that were offered. And so one, we would try to provide new opportunity for those who live in the community, for those shops, the hardware store and whatnot that's missing on Main Street. And then the third point being that one of the diagrams that we showed, unfortunately it's not up there, but it's back there. There's a halo around Main Street of surface lots that are just used for parking, and we would believe that's probably not the highest and best use for that lot. So we think that there's an opportunity there for structured parking that you would certainly be able to maintain all the parking requirements and if not exceed within very close proximity downtown.
Just a comment about that. I grew up in Charlottesville, Virginia, and downtown was transformed entirely and there was a lot of concern that downtown was having real problems. The entire downtown Main Street, and it has the University of Virginia in it, the entire downtown was converted into sort of an open mallish kind of area, totally friendly. And the city actually had problems until that happened. And as a result, the tourist influx actually increased because they restructured and adapted to that. So it was a very, very positive thing in the long run. Again, I have to also say, this is the first time I've come to one of these sessions. I very much applaud what you're trying to get across here in terms of communication, because it's one of those keywords of the day paradigm shift kind of situations where everyone's looking at how to look forward into the future in a very positive, sort of constructive way as opposed to a reactionary way. And I think it's a very, very positive, sort of very, very smart way to start looking at controlling our future instead of reacting to things. And I think Northampton is such a special place that this was a perfect place to try and implement an idea of thinking, future thinking. So I applaud you entirely.
Just to continue on the parking question, something I noticed last night in talking about that is that our parking garage, we exit the parking garage into another parking lot as it is right now. And the idea of turning those surface lots into potentially more retail space and that kind of thing, I think could be useful. And like Robin was saying, increase the tourist traffic and encourage people to actually park in those garages as opposed to trying to find the spot you see first. Because you don't want to like park somewhere that then you have to walk through more parking and then some more parking before you get to the thing you actually want to get to, which is kind of what happens down in the garage. So I love that idea of those lots being turned into more public space and or more retail or even living space potentially, as you mentioned last night. So, and I also second Robin, sort of the forward thinking and imagining the city growing in a way that doesn't sound negative. I think growth, we often see it as sort of a negative right now because we just think of it as sprawl. So, thanks.
In any of your proposals, did you play with the idea of that stretch of Main Street, the 3-4 block, becoming entirely a pedestrian mall and rerouted?
The question is, did we consider closing Main Street, making it more pedestrian, and not allowing traffic through? Is that basically?
Rerouting Route 9.
It came up a lot during the week. And I guess we're all pretty familiar. Dan, I think you've been to the one in Charlottesville, which you mentioned is about the only successful one we've heard. We've heard many proposals across the United States that have done the very same thing, and all the businesses died and things like that. But Charlottesville, and I don't know if you can.
Yeah, there's actually one in Louisville, Kentucky, too, that I'm familiar with, which is actually a theater district. So in a way, it's somewhat different because there's a concentration of venues there, which is, I mean, I think it'd be a different situation than here.
Just to follow up on that, I think one of the issues that we were aware of, it being a state road, there may be implications of closing that road that are beyond what the community may or may not be able to control. But it's always something we think of, and I think in some of the schemes that we had explored, there were some other side streets off of Main Street that we considered going pedestrian.
Masonic Street, for example, in one of our schemes, we looked at making Masonic Street a pedestrian street. And then really, in most of our schemes, we looked really seriously at how to sort of increase the capacity for pedestrian traffic on Main Street by either widening the sidewalks or creating other sort of pedestrian areas and reducing the lane width of the lanes on Main Street in such a way that would still accommodate cars, but would have a sort of calming effect on the traffic there.
I agree. Actually, I'm from Memphis. The gentleman was saying they did that. They closed the business section because of the traffic, and they call it the common. And it didn't die. It grew from that project that they did with the businesses, the downtown shops, and all that. And then they had a parking garage right up above it on the common. So I know of other successful places, and I think that probably would be a general good idea of that whole Main Street from one side to from Pleasant Street to start where Smith College comes in, that one street, just block that off and make it pedestrian friendly so people can get around and they won't have to worry about all those cars coming in and out of there. So whoever suggested that, I think that's a beautiful suggestion because when I thought about it, I was like, Ithaca, New York did the same thing. And they had that same problem with congestion, people not being able to park and doing all this, so they just, 2 or 3 streets they just stopped. It was the business district, and it flourished. The businesses flourished.
I'd just like to say, I'm from Colorado, and Boulder actually has the Pearl Street Mall. And if you've ever walked along, it's very nice and very successful. But Denver tried to do the same thing along 16th Street Mall, and it's pretty dead. It's not really all that successful. And part of it has to do with, you know, how wide the street is and how long the street is and how much you block off. And so there's a varying amount of success with different things, and generally it's not successful unless it's smaller and only a few blocks, because there's a certain amount of safety with eyes and traffic on the street and a constant life flowing through the street that cars can provide. And also, I think it's good to talk about how you can make a street pedestrian friendly and friendly to bikes without necessarily totally negating the presence of the car, because the car can actually be a good presence on the street.
I was most excited about sort of the visual impact of many of your proposals. Really loved all of them, the narrowing of the Main Street and expanding the sidewalk. But what I really also appreciated was some of the practicalities that you addressed about commuters from Village Hill to the interstate, and showing the old trolley lanes, because I'm very close to a trolley line myself in Leeds. It's now a bike path, but I really appreciated, you know, at least resurrecting those ideas and then realizing that if you're going to offer the growth, getting to the interstate is difficult from many parts of the city and the town. So that added a practicality to the visual impact that was very exciting. So thank you.
I love the idea of ballpark structure, not having surface lots on the roads. But I don't see that as consistent with an effort to get more local businesses. We lost the hardware store from downtown because it was hard to park. We lost the coffee shop last year because it was hard to park. So I think there's a conflict there between getting more services.
I think that in none of the schemes that we proposed did we suggest that it would be desirable to eliminate on-street parking or even to eliminate all of the parking lots. And in fact, for a number of the proposals on King Street, we incorporated substantial parking behind the retail, where it was sort of not a major presence on the street, but still allowed for parking. And actually on Main Street, we think that there's a real value even as far as walkability and the pedestrian realm, because the cars parked alongside of the street act as sort of a buffer between the sidewalk and the traffic. So I don't think that any of us think it's a good idea to completely eliminate the on-street parking. That said, we're also aware that parking in the garage, for example, is frequently, well, the garage often has several hundred spaces that are empty. And we're hopeful that a way might be found to sort of encourage people to use the garage, since it's clearly not operating at full capacity, and that perhaps if some of the parking lots were eliminated, people would be encouraged to use the garage. So those are sort of some of the things we're thinking about as far as balancing the need for parking with the need for good public spaces and increased density.
Yeah, I'd also like to add a number of the factors that went into the King Street and the Main Street designs were economic factors. As far as the parking goes along King Street, the northern part that we took a look at currently has 4 lanes of traffic but no on-street parking, and numerous curb cuts along there that wouldn't even allow for on-street parking along there. So some of if along King Street the buildings were pulled up to the edge, you could accommodate a substantial amount of parking, not as much as are in front of the buildings currently, but a substantial amount in front of the buildings along Main Street, just with the elimination of the curb cuts and the addition of on-street parking along King Street. And then the overflow parking could be around the back side of those, as long as there was access to get back behind there along King Street. But the economic issues as far as competition between King Street businesses and the Main Street businesses is going to be one of the issues that we're going to have to confront this semester. Because there's, as we mentioned before, a lot of the Main Street businesses are touristy type of businesses, from what we've heard, as well as the number of numerous restaurants and coffee shops and things like that. But a lot of the residents that live close to the downtown area have complained about the lack of a hardware store within walking distance of downtown area anyway. And also a lot of that has to do with the density of population in those areas. So currently that's a lot we have to balance between the economics of downtown versus the economics of King Street versus the economics regionally of Hadley, East Hampton, and all these different things. So keep that in mind.
You have shown us a lot of interesting visions and broken up into various neighborhoods around the city. I was just wondering whether part of your study you would be prioritizing or helping us maybe determine where to start, or where your vision, where the first focus should be, and so on.
The question was asked as to what would necessarily be the next step for our process, as to if we're able to provide next steps with regard to growth, or what the growth is in our target areas. And I think that's one thing that we've been hoping to try to distill this week in our meetings with the community. And I think that certainly one thing that we'll bring back with us to South Bend, in addition to any comments we're able to receive today, is sort of coming up with a priority or strategies that, there's still the fundamental question that is Northampton to grow, and one safe assumption is to grow at the present rate that it's growing now. But if it were to continue to grow at that rate, how would you accommodate it according to these principles, and where could you accommodate it? And I think that's one of the things that we're hoping to vet, and certainly we will have alternatives by midterm, and then to review and discuss that with the members from the Northampton Design Forum, and then hopefully, one of the ultimate goals of this project in this semester and this term will be to provide a sequence of steps that will deliver this vision, not just the pretty pictures, but actual marry that with a policy and a means to deliver that. So.
Gentlemen, I'm sorry.
My question is a follow-up of his, which is the one we just heard, which is, will each of these areas, as part of your plan, will you you've got 2 or 3 different options in each of these kind of radius that you
will that then the product of the semester be to sort of refine it into one kind of vision and sort of over the course of your feasibility study or the process of the semester, like hold that project on hold?
If I can take a stab at that. Yes and no. Probably, based on past experience, there'll be some specific kinds of policy suggestions and design proposals that we would make. At the same time, part of what we do, there's an inherent sort of uncertainty to what we do in that in providing drawings that suggest a positive vision of what it could look like, we're doing something very specific. And it's impossible in making the drawings to not do something specific. At the same time, at the level of policy and of zoning and of coding and of trying to promote the kind of environment that the images are meant to represent, we realize that that kind of environment can exist with an infinite number of permutations. And so, on the one hand, we have to code for the variety of building types that might go in a certain place with a certain density. And what that means is that in some ways it would be the market, or the market acting in concert with the community that will determine the kinds. If you've got a number of different kinds of units of different densities that are permitted in a given mixed-use zone, then the density of that zone will depend upon what developers or the public sector choose to build. And so we're trying to be specific on the one hand, but on the other hand, we're trying to provide. We can't help but provide a certain degree of flexibility because we respect people's freedom, and so we presume we're trying to make suggestions and not sort of act like we know best how people live their lives.
Will you be making some recommendations to Northampton about how we might begin to develop a form-based code or transact zone code? That one of your...
Yeah, the question was whether we would be making any recommendations about how Northampton might adjust its zoning and sort of legal framework in order to accommodate this sort of development. And the answer is that yes, we are going to be studying form-based codes, again, as opposed to the sort of conventional use-based codes, which most communities have used as their guidelines for the last 50 years or so. And as part of the report that we're going to be putting together by the end of the semester, one of the things that we'll be doing is actually coming up with a code that will suggest at least the framework for a legal structure that would allow and encourage the kind of development that we're designing. So
a draft code.
Yes, a draft code, right, yes, we're not lost in this, but yes.
A few people earlier mentioned a desire to review the presentations and your materials, and a lot of that is actually up now at the North Street Neighborhood Association website, northasoc.org. This presentation will go up, the evening presentations are on there, so that is one outlet that's available for people to look at, these in work. Yep. Yep.
Thank you.
Couldn't hear the name of the website.
Northasoc.org.
Yeah, NORTHASSOC.org.
We have printouts from the website on a chair by the side over there. There's a table now.
Yes. Yes.
I'm almost embarrassed to bring this up because it's a small detail, but you're trying to encourage cycling, using bicycles. Wouldn't it be nice to have storage for bicycles which is covered? In other words, places where you can lock your bike and have a roof over the top so you don't have to sit on a wet saddle.
The suggestion was made that we should look into providing some bike storage structures in downtown so that to keep it out of the elements. I think it's an excellent suggestion. And there's a whole, all the things that have been proposed today are certainly broad brush, initial schemes, and when we get into the details, we'll be able to incorporate a lot of things like that. For example, also there are programs that equivalent to zip cars, but for bikes that are now available in a number of communities that we would like to incorporate. I think this would be a great opportunity for that here. So.
This this is another kind of small detail thing, but I'm just curious if you plan to look at sort of the street patterning around Main Street, because I'm just thinking about the parking situation, things like that, and right now it's really hard to get to the parking garage, actually, I mean, in a very efficient way, and it's the same on the other side of Main Street. There's a lot of streets that go all the way through to, say, State Street, from State Street to King Street, you know, et cetera, for the Main Street curves, blah, blah, blah. So I just wondered if you were thinking about those.
I actually got the opportunity to look at that quite extensively last night and early this morning. So, yeah, it's pretty complicated, and there are a lot of kind of nonsensical streets that go through, and I call it the jelly bean block. It's my favorite block. It's a really little one that looks like jelly bean. But anyway, so I was trying to address that, and I've started to address it a little bit in the scheme to bring 66 through and the cut through, and the one that actually cuts through some private property is probably a better option as far as the street end goes, but they're kind of a little bit interchangeable. Like you could connect the same block system back through on the bike path as well. So if you want to take a look at that and talk to me about it at some point, comment on it, that would be great. It is quite complicated behind Main Street.
I've been really struck by your transect diagram, because I think what it illustrates is that there are three main areas around downtown that are opportunities that are not within the transect. Basically Hospital Hill, aka Village Hill, North King Street, and South on Pleasant Street. And I wonder whether you all have a sense, after having been in Northampton for a week, of whether those areas which are not within the transect are the areas for future growth, or whether future growth should be concentrated within the areas which are already within our urban core in the form of infill and greater density development, or whether future development should be concentrated in sort of village clusters that are not necessarily oriented to downtown, but are, you know, dispersed throughout the city as a whole. So meaning Florence, Leeds, and downtown all get equal densification.
So the question was essentially observing the existence of districts in Northampton which don't conform to the transect of the urban transect. What did we feel was the priority as far as developing, future development, whether it should fall in those areas that are currently not conforming, in neighborhoods that are as infill within neighborhoods that are good examples of mixed-use walkable neighborhoods, or in outlying areas in the sense of creating new village centers in areas that are currently rural, that is to say, transect zones 1 or 2, sort of rural or agricultural or natural. Is that sort of what you were saying?
Yeah,
so,
the last point being areas like the post-1945 subdivisions that are currently not walkable.
I guess the answer is that so far we've found it most profitable to look at the areas that are near to downtown, that we, first of all, I guess we'd like to sort of let be some of the neighborhoods that seem to be functioning really well right now, and focus our areas on those neighborhoods that we feel don't function so well and could use some help. But we're not looking exclusively at those areas, and one of the things especially that I think we're hoping to look at during the course of the semester is the possibility of creating some mixed use and smaller village centers within some of the outlying residential subdivisions and some of the rural areas. Ideally at places where there are existing intersections or layouts in neighborhoods that suggest that they could easily become a sort of mixed use center. So it would be a variety of those things.
And just to follow up on Aaron's point, I actually would argue that those are not competing schemes, actually that all those options are very much coming from the same basis and same design principles. And I would say, rather, like, in referencing back to Phil's earlier comment, that in looking at King Street and University Hospital and Pleasant Street and the other neighborhoods, and outlining a vision for them, it would, and showing what they could be, and sort of coding for that, and then letting the market and the community decide as to when, when growth seeks a certain area, then you could provide both infill and those communities that, if growth were to occur in King Street, it would take this form. But if it if it were to happen on Pleasant Street, it would take that form. And so it sort of is placeholders for the future and that.
One of the problems with King Street that the city has wrestled with, it's very dangerous. It's a very dangerous for cars. It's not, turning left across 2 lanes of oncoming traffic is inherently dangerous. And if you're going to increase the diversity and even put residential out there, I'd be interested as that if you, I don't know what the range of your expertise, or if you have access to kind of traffic engineering, but the idea of how that kind of road is handled, how you handle that kind of traffic, how you channel.
Well, it seems that one of the problems right now with King Street is that you have a lot of parking lots with a lot of entrances coming out, and the entrances aren't coordinated. So the benefit of building in a block and street or T or diagram where the streets actually connect and make a grid so that they connect across is that you can actually find places to put in stoplights and actually start to control the movements of the traffic a little bit more, rather than having them spread out and at places where people may not be expecting to encounter cars pulling out in front of them. So hopefully our scheme will actually resolve a lot of those issues just by limiting the curb cuts on the main avenue.
I'd just like to follow up on that. You used the word funneling traffic, and that actually is one of the problems when you get a road like that where the road becomes the major artery that is the only option for drivers to go down. You get a lot of cars going down one road, and there's only so much that road can handle. And so in our schemes at looking at King Street, we've looked at a variety of options, but inherent in the options is providing options for cars to travel along adjacent streets, or creating more of a network instead of simply a funneled one single option. So that way it would divert a lot of the traffic and slow things down and give people more options.
Just one final to tack on to Bruce's comments. One thing that's been referenced several times this week is the notion of design speed, and that there's a disparity between the speed at which drivers feel safe driving and the speed limit. And oftentimes our roads are over-designed, over-constructed to account for a margin of safety, but it's a perverse incentive to speed. And so there are tools that you can include, such as parallel parking, and also just by bringing in the building blocks to the street width, that creates a sense of enclosure and just naturally slows down the design speed for those roads.
Have you ever considered using roundabouts? In Europe, there are roundabouts everywhere that regulate speed.
Certainly, the question was, have we considered roundabouts? And I think if we point back to, I think almost all of our schemes have a roundabout where Northampton has these wild intersections where you get more than 4 roads coming in at once. And sometimes they have topography in there to be fun. And so we've included that, for example, in all the downtown schemes, looking at where Vermont in Elm Street sort of turns the corner and heading north out of town, an opportunity there, right at the corner with where Smith College is. And I know in King Street and in Pleasant Street, in the Pleasant Street scheme, there was also a roundabout as well.
And the Route 66 cut through as well to feed into downtown to actually make an actual intersection where you can go straight through, trying to go back and resolve some of those block issues as well.
I really liked the schemes of showing 2 possibilities for Main Street. I really like the one where the street is narrowed and the sidewalks are widened for 2 reasons. One is, some of the restaurants could possibly have street dining, and there's some restaurants that do that already, but it could make it a really pleasant experience, and also to provide more trees to kind of shade Main Street, which gets really, really hot in the summer. Maybe I didn't understand the scheme that had the park or the thing in the middle with the pergola, and I was just curious if the pergola was in between both the lanes of traffic, and how narrow or wide would that be?
Yeah, that's a great question. The question is, on the scheme for Main Street to show the median with the pergola, how wide that would be and what the function would be. I think probably, I mean, we have the size of it is probably between 10 and 15 feet, maybe.
No, actually.
It is.
Depending on where you are on Main Street, the sidewalks, if they stay the same, can be around 30 feet between the narrowest portion. But further east, closer to Bridge Street, you go down by the old courthouse building, or the current county building. It can widen to up to about 60 feet. And one of the proposals that we were looking at is having 2 lanes of traffic and then the farmer's market in between that, to almost create a sort of, I guess, pedestrian area. Obviously, there's issues with crossing 2 lanes of traffic to get into there and everything, but we figured some of the design can accommodate bulb outs and other ways of accessing the central median, similar to what Edinburgh has, I guess.
The other thing is that median is actually wide enough that it could accommodate, and there's enough breaks in it that you could accommodate several different types of parks down the center. You could have trees, you could have flowers and fountains, and you could have, I mean, depending on how much you wanted to spend on your landscaping. But then you could also have a plaza, so there could be different types of spaces in that center median that could actually be occupiable, and they're spacious enough that you would actually feel like it would be a nice place to hang out. So.
I think we'd like to take just 1 or 2 more questions and then allow people to have some time to sort of walk around and look at the drawings. Yes.
I just want to thank you. You've all been very professional. You've been accessible. Your doors were open even when it wasn't really time to stop in. I want to appreciate that. About the King Street on your transects, it was white because it didn't land in a transect. Are there any other cities in the U.S. That have transformed a non-transect similar into one of the successful plans you're talking about?
Mashpee Commons.
Mashpee Commons, which is a local example on the eastern edge of the state. There's actually there. I could, if I can get your email, I can send you a list for 400. Just off the top of my head. I mean, one example in Miami, in the community of Kendall took a suburban mall and arterial condition and created a city, a village there. And that's underway. That started over 10 years ago. So there's across the country in all different types of economies. This has been going on. So.
Yeah, one more.
Again, I want to reiterate what she said, which is that I very much appreciate the work you all have done, and you have been very open. What Amy just mentioned brought up a good point, which is that widening Main Street would allow for a wider planting strip so that the trees on Main Street may actually survive. And one thing that I have somewhat missed in your work over the course of the week has been a focus on sort of the green infrastructure of Northampton. I would imagine that areas like North King Street and the industrial park, which were settled later, were probably settled later due to underlying existing landforms and the existing of wetlands. So I just would encourage you, as you continue your work, to consider opportunities for restoring the natural environment of Northampton, and also building into your designs, the emerging movement towards bringing wastewater, not wastewater, but dealing with stormwater on site, eliminating surface parking lots because they increase flood heights, etc.
Just to follow up from Dylan's comment, that certainly, for example, one of the schemes for our university or Village Hill or Hospital Hill, the residential units included urban agricultural plots, and so it's something we're very conscious of, and we have additional diagrams that we haven't yet presented, but it's certainly something to keep in mind.
We haven't had time to draw trees yet.
Put them in first.
It's now almost 6:15, and it is 6:15, 6:14 and a half. Thank you all very much. It's really been a pleasure for us to be here. We're very excited about, we're looking forward to the rest of the semester. Anxious to hear from you. Hopefully we do, students do get a website up, and we're looking forward to our next month of work and the feedback from that, and looking forward to our visit in December. Thank you for all your hospitality, your kindness, your constructive criticism,